Just a quick announcement. Has someone dropped their bank card? Jean Ling? Anybody drop their bank card? Yes.
Good evening. Welcome to 66 Portland Place, the home of the Royal Institute of British Architects. I'm Alan Jones. I'm President-elect of the RIBA. As Ben Derbyshire calls me, the incoming president. Ben today has been spending a lot of time talking to the media about Notre Dame and what has went on there in Paris. I don't think it's a case of a minute's silence. I hope that the project will, over time, regain its magnificence. But it would be inappropriate not to mention that project and what has happened in Paris. So our thoughts are with that project and the people working on saving it. On behalf of current President Ben Derbyshire and myself, I would like to say thank you for joining us for this RIBA and VitrA talk with Daniel Libeskind tonight. Our thanks also go to VitrA Bathrooms, who are partnering with the RIBA by sponsoring this exciting series, showcasing the best in contemporary, established, and emerging voices in architecture. We are delighted to have Bulent Esha-Shabashi, chairman of the Esha-Shabashi Group, here with us this evening. And thank you for your support, for supporting the talk series. Leading architects are speaking in events which will take place here in London, across the UK, and also internationally in Istanbul, Turkey. We're delighted Daniel Libeskind will be jetting off to Istanbul tomorrow to give the first VitrA and RIBA talk in Istanbul on Thursday. We are live streaming tonight's event on architecture.com and the RIBA's YouTube channel. So a warm welcome, hello, also to you all out there watching. We are thrilled to be joined by Daniel Libeskind this evening. Daniel is an architect that needs no introduction. A hugely important Polish-American architect who has created some of the most distinctive buildings around the world. He is known globally for landmarks such as the World Trade Center Master Plan, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and of course, the Imperial War Museum North in Manchester, slightly closer to home. Tonight, Daniel will be speaking in conversation with writer and curator Priya Khanchandani about his new publication, Edge of Order. Priya is editor of design and architecture magazine Icon. She has also curated the India Pavilion at London Design Biennale 2018 and was head of arts programs for India at the British Council. You may have purchased Daniel Libeskind's new book, The Edge of Order, before the talk this evening. We are absolutely thrilled Daniel will be signing copies of the book following the talk. Books will still be available to purchase from the RIBA bookshop after the talk, so don't miss out on this great opportunity. Finally, a couple of points of housekeeping before we begin. You are welcome to keep your mobile phones on, but please turn them to silent or vibrate. There isn't a fire alarm planned, but if there is, it's the real thing, and the exits can be found at the front and the back of the hall. If you are a social media user, please feel free to tweet and Insta-post. The hashtag for the event is #RIBAVitrA. After the talk, we'll have an opportunity for questions from the audience, so please do keep your questions in mind over the next hour. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Daniel Libeskind and Priya Khanchandani to the stage.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Priya Khanchandani. And hello also to those of you watching from home. Wonderful to have you. Daniel, it's really great to meet you and to have a conversation with you tonight to tie in with the launch of your new book. Clearly, you've made your name through architecture that deals with memory. And I can't think of a more appropriate time to be talking about this subject, given the events in Paris yesterday evening, with the Notre Dame, as Alan mentioned, being saved from destruction after a terrible fire. I was wondering to start with if you could reflect a bit on memory, which I know you've written about in your book, and how you think architecture can be harnessed as a vehicle to remember and deal with the past.
Well, thank you. It's a very sad moment. In fact, just the day before yesterday, I had 2 hours to sketch the Notre Dame. I don't normally have 2 hours, but I went to the Notre Dame. It's one of my favorite buildings. And when I saw the tragedy unfolding, I thought how careless humanity really is. We don't protect our buildings. The heritage is in stone. It speaks to us. And in that case, it was the scream of the stone that has been neglected for decades and decades. I've read already reports on the vulnerable state of Notre Dame years ago. It belongs to the nation, to French nation. I spoke just to Charles Jenks, who is a friend, old friend of mine. It is a kind of a rape of history that we can see by carelessness and forgetting that memory is actually the ground of architecture. And I don't mean this as a personal just opinion, but I really believe that it's not real estate, it's not just a physical ground on which a building is built, but deep below the site lies memory, which really connects us all across borders, across religions, across nations, across ethnicities. That's the memory into which architecture is built. And I guess from the very first act of building, I believed that to be truly, deeply part of what architecture communicates.
Were you just at the Notre Dame out of coincidence?
Incredible coincidence. I said to Nina, who's here, my wife and partner, let's go. And I normally don't have a sketchbook with me. And I bought a sketchbook in one of those cheap stores, across the Seine. And I went across to sketch the cathedral because it's just one of the most incredible documents of the spiritual culture that we have.
What an incredible document to have, just moments before the fire.
It's true. It was literally just some hours before. It's very sad.
That's incredible. Now, one of the difficult histories that you've dealt with through your work is obviously 9/11, which you've grappled with through your master plan for the World Trade Center. I was wondering how you dealt with tragic events that have really touched so many people, and that everybody has had an opinion on, from the president to the postman. How did you grapple with this huge task of commemorating this event?
It's hard to describe it very quickly, but it must be one of the most difficult projects anyone can possibly undertake because there is no one client. If you think of the ground zero, you have to think who is the stakeholders. The stakeholders, first of all, in my view, started with the families. There are almost 3,000 people perished, but the families are in thousands. Uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, cousins. We have thousands and thousands of members of families. We have the Port Authority that owns and leases the land to private investors and their own architects. We have the governor, 2 powerful governors of New Jersey and New York that are in charge of controlling the Port Authority. We've got the mayor of New York in charge of the streets of New York. We've got the path trains that really are underground and the subway authorities, MTA. So
how did you navigate all these different stakeholders and the infrastructure of the existing
So this was my idea. Most master plans are never realized. Really, you see them in archives, you see them in museums, because after 5 years, all conditions have changed, and reality just moves on. So most master plans are just figments of the time. But I thought, how to get this thing built? You need to get a consensus.
Right.
And we know how fraught democracy is and how difficult and polarized it is. But it is possible, and that's my belief in a democracy, that if you can bring people to share a common goal, a common idea, you can build the foundations, what I call memory, foundations, of memory foundations, which is what I call the project, and set the foundations and divide the site in a practical way that you could really build segments of it in time. And of course, it's not finished. It's about 85% finished. Tower number 2 is not yet there. The Performing Arts Center is under construction. So it's getting there. But I think, to answer your question, you have to have a faith in the future. And you have to have true commitment to democracy. Many people said to me, wouldn't you prefer to work in China? They would build this in 2 years. It would be over. Everything would be gleaming, perfect. You wouldn't have any headaches.
Why do you think this took so much longer?
Because in a democracy, it's hard. It's not an instant. There is no one person who's just, authoritarian rule that, do it and it's done. You have to really struggle. And that's part of the beauty of democracy.
Do you think it's partly because healing is a process and architecture doesn't come and go overnight, so deciding what form it should take takes time?
Well, it does take time. Healing does take time, but more than that, it takes time to speak to the thousands of people who really have a stake in the project. And you can imagine at the beginning, the stakeholders were completely divided as to what to do. Remember the mayor of New York at that time, Giuliani, didn't want to have any tall buildings. Strange as it sounds.
Wow.
The lawyer for our president. He wanted low buildings. Others wanted megastructures in the center of the site. Others wanted to redefine New York in architectural ways. My idea was not to build anything, really, where the tragedy happened. Now, think about it. No one declared this to be a sacred site. Just a piece of real estate. And every square centimeter, every square inch of real estate in New York is extremely expensive, whether it's on top, on the bottom, or in the middle. And so you have to really sort of struggle to say something about public space. And that was my idea. Devote the project to the public interest, public space.
So what proportion of the site did you end up
half of it,
devoting to
8 acres, are public space, which includes the memorial.
Yeah.
And includes all the way down to bedrock, with the slurry and so on, and a 16-acre slide. But I have to tell you the truth. I always thought of my parents. My parents were workers, factory workers in New York. My mother worked in the sweatshops of New York, and my father was a printer on Stone Street, just around the... And I always thought to myself, if my parents had been alive, what would they be getting from this redevelopment? They would never be lucky enough to work, in the towers. They didn't have... That's not their world. They were in the subways, on the streets, trying to feed their families, like 99% of New York. What would they get? So I thought, what would they get? A vista, a view, a hope, a connection with the past, a street, something that is for everyone, a good transportation system. That was also part of my design, how to link the subways and the PATH trains back into the fabric of that site. So yes, I thought about it, that it's not just for the people who are working there, who are lucky enough to be in the towers, but really just New Yorkers. The public space.
That's really interesting.
And by the way, that was not easy, because everybody wants that private space. Developers own. They used to have the center of that site. It was a big struggle to convince people that it's not right to build where people perished. There's something wrong with it. Yeah. It just doesn't really make sense to build something where you could not really build something ethically, morally, in any way, spiritually. And then you can, put the buildings as far away as possible on the periphery of the site to leave really the maximum of sunlight and put green and the waterfalls. That was also a very controversial part of my site.
Was it really?
Oh, yes. I remember the New York Post had a headline, "The absurd Libeskind plane brings Niagara Falls to the center of New York." But, it was an idea.
That monument's actually incredibly moving, if any of you have seen it.
I thought it was very important to have, first of all, the acoustical sound of water, to have a private experience with the names and with the spiritual sense of the site, and also to bring something living, which is into this hardscape of New York.
It's also the scale of it, which you don't quite expect in the middle of Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, it is the largest space that has been created. And I have to tell you, since I started working, something like 300,000 people moved next to the site.
Wow.
When I started working on it, most experts even thought that Ground Zero would never be again, a living place. They thought nobody would come back, companies will not move back, nobody would want to live there. There was a pessimism, but I always thought that, by building something that is meaningful, you really assert the victory of life over evil deeds that befell New York and the world.
But it's actually been completely regenerated now,
Totally.
that downtown Manhattan.
Totally. There's something like 30 million people every day who come to the site, every year to come to the site, and the site is not complete.
Now, before we talk about some more of your more recent projects, I wanted to move back and talk about your early life and career a little bit to put things in context. You mentioned that, about your parents working in sweatshops. I know that your parents were Holocaust survivors, and you were born in a homeless shelter in Poland. I was wondering if you could tell us how you discovered architecture, what drew you to become an architect, which is conventionally quite a privileged profession.
It's really hard to believe that I became an architect. Really, coming from where I came from, I was, for a large portion of my life, young life, I was a professional musician. I was a virtuoso, probably on the wrong instrument. And the truth is that...
You were an accordion player, correct?
I was, yes. And I have to tell you the story because it's also my fate. Had I not played the accordion, I would have never been an architect.
You'll have to tell us how one...
I lived in Poland, in those years of communism and totalitarianism, the oppression of Polish people. And anti-Semitism was part of the world that I grew up in. And my parents were too afraid to bring the piano to the courtyard. We lived in a courtyard in a city, and they were too scared. So they told me a piano in a suitcase.
Wow.
Half of it looked like a piano, the other half did not. It was the accordion. So I became a virtuoso in this instrument. Actually, when I came to Israel, I competed in the America-Israel Prize for music, and I was the only winner, together with Itzhak Perlman. He won on the violin, I won the accordion. There were only 5 winners. And Isaac Stern, who was the head of the jury, said to me, or I was, 12 years old, he said, you've already, exhausted everything you can possibly do on this instrument. You've got to play the piano. But it's easy to say. It's very hard to go from the vertical to the horizontal. But in architecture, it's easy.
So how did the music profession manage to lose you to architecture?
I actually strangely don't feel that I gave up music, because to me, architecture is very much like that. It's produced in a similar way. You have to write a score, let's say a master plan, a drawing. You have to give that score to others to kind of interpret and build. You are not present on the stage as a conductor, or maybe your back is present to an audience, but the score has to be very precise, just like a musical score, geometrically, and every vibration has to be correct. And at the end, it's not intellectual. It has to communicate to the human heart or to the human soul. The music, which is mechanical, doesn't have any being as music, and so that architecture too. It's not just an object. It has to sort of communicate to something deeper in you. So how did I become an architect? I have no idea, because I went to School of Architecture, a great school. I had mentors, and I even worked for a couple of famous architects for 1 or 2 days. And I didn't like it, I have to tell you. I was a little bit embarrassed because I had these jobs. And after 2 days, I said, this is just too boring. There's got to be more to architecture than this. And so for many years, I did something else. I taught, I drew. And when I came to Berlin after winning the competition for what later became the Jewish Museum, I turned to my wife and said to her, will you become my partner to build this building in Berlin? And she said to me very fateful words. She turned to me and said, I've never been in an architect's office in my life. How can I possibly help you? And I said, the same applies to me. I've never been in the architect's office. So that's how I became an architect.
So you studied at the Cooper Union, of course, the School of Art, Architecture and Engineering in Manhattan.
Yes.
Which was a kind of quite traditional modernist school of architecture. Is that how you describe it?
I wouldn't say it was modernist. I wouldn't say traditional. It was kind of like the AA here in London at that time. It was a school trying to go against the sort of corporate architectural themes and trying to rediscover, some roots of architecture that had meaning.
How did you respond to that?
Well, I had great teachers, but I rebelled against my education, which was very good. It started with squares.
Is it true you tore up your professor's
book?
Oh, yes.
That's a really wonderful story. I had a teacher. One of my teachers was Peter Eisenman, famous architect. And he was giving a class in theory. And I said, and he had a great book. He had all the, names of students. And he said, here are the names. And I said, Mr. Eisenman, Professor Eisenman, if you're going to be teaching theory, you have to get rid of your marking book. It can't be about marks. Great. And he said, okay, you want to come over here and rip my book apart? Rip it? I was really crazy and very, I walked up and I ripped up the book. And indeed, we had no grades, which was the right thing for theory. Should never
Is
have grades
this a
for
lesson for any architecture students in the audience today?
Well, look,
How to succeed?
well, look, it's not assessment of others that makes you into who you are. You have to fight for your own integrity and also resist pressures to conform. And those are, my mother probably, she came from a famous Hasidic family. But ultimately, who are the Hasids? They are kind of anarchists. They're rebels against established order. So, yeah, I guess I had it from my mother, who really seldom appreciated top grades. She said, what does a top grade mean? It means nothing to you. It means something to a teacher, but not to you.
So you mentioned having tried out a few architecture roles. I mean, the first, of course, was with Richard Meyer, who you worked with on finishing the Cooper Union, and whose office you famously left after 2 days. Was that because you sensed very early on that you wanted to work for yourself?
No, I had no idea what I wanted to do. That would be false to admit that I followed a path. I had no goal. Most people tell you should have a goal, reach for your goal. My idea was don't have any goal, but have a path without being pulled left or right. Just stay on the path, and something will happen to you. It's kind of a Zen, actually. Later on, I discovered Taoist idea. You follow the path. But in truth, really, I did follow a path which really started with my love for drawing. And I love drawing, and I think it's something amazing that this field of architecture, just think about it, this table could have not be made without a drawing. This cup, this glass, could not have been made without a drawing. This stage, this building, never mind London itself. So everything comes out of a drawing, and it's a mystery to me how something that comes out of a line, something that you can draw, becomes a reality that is so potent that we forget how it originated. It originated somewhere by someone, inscribing some trace of desire or meaning.
I mean, after that, you, of course, went on to become an architecture professor, which is perhaps an inversion of a traditional path of an architect who may start out of practice and finish off in academia. How do you think that inversion of paths, led to your success?
It's a good question. I've often thought about it. I've lived my life in reverse. Most people start young and get older. I started old and became younger. No, really, because, I started with meditation and with no really kind of jobs.
If you can tell us all the secret to eternal youth, that would be really helpful.
Well, you see, I started by meditating almost on nothing because I had no experience. And I read and I theorized and I drew. And only later on in my life was I able to realize a building and another building. So, as you said, most in Western tradition think that first you have the active part of your life, then the reflective part. I had the reflective without the action, and now the action, hopefully with reflection.
I mean, we'll get on to your built project shortly, but before we do, one of your early successes was a project called City Edge, which was exhibited at MoMA in 1988 and seemed to be a kind of turning point in your career being recognized, even though the project wasn't actually built. In that exhibition, the curator referred to that piece of architecture as being deconstruction. Well, you'll probably pronounce this better than me.
Deconstructivist, yes.
Deconstructivist architecture, which was kind of breaking up the right angles of modernism that had dominated architecture probably a few decades earlier. I just wondered how you'd respond to that term, and how did you respond at the time to being categorized in that way?
Well, when I got a call. I was living in Milan at that time, sort of trying to establish an alternative to practice and to teaching in a sort of small, sort of independent architecture intermundium. It's a word from Coleridge, it's like in between. And I got a call from Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was one of, he was half of the collection of Museum of Modern Art, is Philip Johnson collection. And he was the most powerful, probably person in the field of architecture in America for decades and decades. And he just called me and he said, would you like to be? My first impression was like, what am I to do there? I don't have any buildings. What kind of thing? But to answer your question, deconstruction is a bad term. It's good maybe in philosophy. It's good in literary criticism, even in legal sociology. You could use the term. And it's a term invented by Jacques Derrida, whom I knew later on. But it's really bad for architecture because architecture is not about it's about putting things together. It's about assembling heterogeneous things into something. It's not, taking them apart. So I thought it was a very esoteric term, which is popular. I guess the term was like existentialism in the 1960s, right? Or 50s. Everybody was an existentialist. Whatever that meant, that you existed.
If you wouldn't describe your work according to that term, then how would you describe the way that you were responding to modernist architecture? Because there was a kind of departure from it and a wish to express something very bold and which you'll see,
yes.
The kind of aesthetic that you'll see on these slides is quite distinctive.
Modernism is an ism. I never liked any isms. Any ism is already an allergy for me. But modernity is not an ism. Modernity moves on. And, we are celebrating 100th-year anniversary of the Bauhaus, right? And I was in Weimar and I was in Bauhaus. And
I was there too. I wonder if it was at the same time.
Could have been. And I always wondered, like, if Gropius, Albers, Kandinsky, Breuer, Paul Klee, if they were living today, they would definitely not be doing that work. They'd be doing something totally different because our society has changed. It was a social movement, an aesthetic movement, a technological movement. So I was always perplexed that people think that reality stopped, like in 1927 or something, or 1955. Reality doesn't stop, it keeps ticking. And it goes on in unpredictable ways.
So after this came your first building commission, which was Felix Nussbaum in Germany in the late 90s. I was wondering if you could tell me, if you don't wish to ascribe to a particular movement, then who you were looking to in terms of your contemporaries or architects that had come before you when you came up with this kind of collision of metal and glass and kind of cuboids that created quite a distinctive form.
I don't think I was looking at, let me put it this way. I once read a letter of Le Corbusier to his office at 35 Rue de Sèvres in Paris. And I read the letter, and I actually have a copy of it, which said, if I catch anybody reading an architecture magazine, I'm going to fire you. It's Corbusier. He's kind of a god. But I always thought there was something wise about what he was saying, because fashions come and go, but architecture is here to stay. So where do you look for inspiration? I would say I was looking at inspiration at a kind of cross-section, and not only at architects, because who said architecture comes from architecture? Architecture comes from society, it comes from technology, it comes from history, it comes from art, it comes from...
Who are your contemporary influences, if not architecture?
Contemporary music, contemporary literature, contemporary cinema. I don't know whether I could isolate and say, this is, I'm a follower of, I don't know, of Antonioni,
yes.
in films, or I'm a follower of...
He's brilliant.
I wish I could have said that. Or a follower of, John Hawkes in literature, or a follower of, Jasper Johns, or something like that, painting in the 60s. But that was not my idea. It's kind of, you immerse yourself in your time. You live in your time, not behind and not before. And that's where your work comes from. And of course, if you're interested in architecture, you study history, you study what other people have done, but not 10 years before, but 1,000 years before. And I remember spending a long time, and I had the good luck to study with two great people, Dalibor Vesely, who passed away recently, and Joseph Rickert, the great historian. And, I studied, triglyphs and pediments of Greek temples. I thought this was amazing because, it was not originally part of my education. My education was about how to construct buildings.
Yeah.
But to suddenly get into a discourse about something so antique, which is always, of course, relevant, did change my idea of where to look for inspiration.
Okay. The commission that really has defined your career came next, which is the Jewish Museum in Berlin.
I have to correct you. These are not really commissions. Neither the Felix Nussbaum, when I won that quote competition, which is usually winning a ticket to oblivion. You win a competition, it's nothing. Don't believe that competition leads you to glory. On the contrary, it's just exercise of publicity on behalf of some other institutions. When I won that competition, I remember I came to the city of Osnabrück, small city, near the Dutch border. And the head of, we had newspapers were there. Mr. Libeskind, hello, great. There's a Felix Nussbaum museum is going to be built. And as I shook the hand of the Bau director, the director of building, powerful person, the most powerful in the city, he said to me, "You're never going to build this building in my city." And my wife, Nina, who's much smarter than I am, was just behind me, and she said to him, "Do you want to make a bet?"
And how did you make it happen?
I don't think I can claim credit. I think half of the things that I've done, or more, are really by the talent of my wife and partner. Because she's got like politics and the running in her veins. I only know angles and colors. I don't know those things, but she kind of taught me a little bit how complicated the world of the politics of realizing even a modest building, and that was a very modest building.
So by this point, you've established an architecture practice in Berlin, is that correct? And
Well,
Nina was instrumental.
Architecture
in
practice is the following. I had a desk.
Yeah.
I had ink. I was still using a ruling pen. I had pencils. I had vellum and paper. Nina had the telephone. And I had a big library of books.
You're making this sound a very, very long time ago.
That's all it was. Look, the Jewish Museum is probably the last building built in the 20th century, as I reflect upon it, that has been done completely by hand. With logarithm, have to calculate the angles. There was no computers in Berlin at that time. We certainly didn't have them. And so it was probably the last building to be done completely in an old-fashioned way by, section, plan, elevation, details, geometrical projections, projective geometry, all those old sort of things. So it wasn't really established a practice. First, a young man walked in, Matthias Razor, and he said, "I'm German, I would like to work on this project. I'd like to try." I said, "What have you built?" He said, "I built a small house." Great. But my great idea here, I have to tell you, was people said, "Now you better hire some real architects, because you're in trouble. Hire people who really know how to make windows, foundations. You know nothing." And my idea was, don't hire those people at all. Hire only people without any experience, which is a pretty stupid thing, actually, if I think about it. But actually it worked, because I thought for a thing like the Jewish Museum Berlin, you don't want experienced people. You don't want people who know about windows, because who would know about windows for a project like that? People who know about doors. You don't want people who know about doors. So I really had a group of young, mostly German young architects who had just started. And it was an adventure, and the roof was not leaking.
Now, that building is obviously characterized by the use of kind of quite extreme angles, and you're kind of guided through the building, and this immersive experience recreates the sort of oppression, I suppose, of the Holocaust. And what made you want to design a building in which the experience of the architecture was all-consuming?
Well, you didn't think about it this way. I just, it's not a building I went to research in the archives or in history books or in library. It was just part of my life, that atmosphere. And that's why I didn't provide in that museum any redemptive space. There's no atrium, like in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I didn't believe in it, particularly in Berlin and in Germany. There should not be a moment where you think, okay, now I understand, now we are in a different time. No, there's no redeeming feature in this history at all, never will be. And so, kind of that's what I drew. It wasn't, and I wanted to tell a story, by the way. And I was excoriated. But, there's an issue of German intellectual magazine called Bauwelt, with all the most famous historians of Germany, famous architects. I still have an issue of it, who all said, this building cannot be built. If it is built, it will fail because nobody will come to the building. And if they come to the building, they will understand nothing because it's confusing. But they were not right. I did tell a story, but it's not a story in words. It's a story in the materials and proportions, in the echoes, in the light of the building. And so I think now people are much more accepting that a building does tell a story. Look at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
What a story. You look at it. You don't even have to be educated or go to school to understand that you're being told something that is absolutely consuming, and you understand that it's being communicated to you personally. That's, I think, the tradition of architecture.
I mean, I guess that particular project and something that's characterized your work is its ability to kind of conjure up a feeling associated with history through an immersive experience. But I'm also interested in your relationship to historic architecture. You've worked with historic architecture in a number of your projects, the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, and the other one that comes to mind was the Military Museum in Dresden. I was wondering what is your relationship to historic architecture and why you have decided to approach your interventions into it in quite a bold and quite specific way.
It's a great question. Well, it depends on the context. Obviously, each context is different. You can't generalize. But when it comes, let's say, to a project like the military history of Germany, I didn't want to do what I think all the architects in the competition did, just build behind the old armory. The old armory was already a military museum in the 19th century at the end, became the museum of the Nazis, became the museum of the Soviets, of East Germany. I thought that this building had a history. You should not hide the military behind walls or behind, the building. You should cut the history in a very radical way. And chronologically, in that building is exactly between 1945 and 1914 and 1945, which is the militaristic years that stemmed from Germany and destroyed so much of the world. In San Francisco, there was a city beautiful facade. I had very small place to express that this also is now no longer the power station of electricity, but a museum for people.
Yeah.
So yes, but I always was interested in, the building has to say something to you.
Yeah.
Even if it's obscure at first and you just see blue and you see 36 windows, you might wonder why it's so precise.
I mean, you said something really interesting about this approach that I once read, which was, it was not my intention to preserve the museum's facade and just add an invisible extension in the back. I wanted to create a bold interruption, a fundamental dislocation to penetrate the historic arsenal and create a new experience. I was just wondering how you might feel about an architect in 100 years' time kind of penetrating one of your own buildings and how you might want them to do that.
It's already penetrated by the users. I mean, amazing. the people who use those buildings use them in original ways, very different from the first photographs of how the building was built. Sure, people have...
In what kind of context?
They put curtains, they put flowers on ledges, they
Are
buy
you not a big
furniture.
fan of flowers?
No, I'm a fan of flowers, but I wouldn't put a flower pot on my ledge. I prefer a bigger window. So anyway, people use the buildings, and I think that's the beauty of architecture, that it's a social art, and people are empowered to complete the building in their own ways. The architects only do 50%.
Yeah.
They do only half of it. The other half is people who are creative, who use the buildings, and who are supplementing their own artistic vision into the building.
Yeah. I mean, one building that you didn't want to kind of interrupt or dislocate was the 1971 Gio Ponti building that you were asked to create a new building adjacent to, i.e. the Denver Art Museum. I was wondering how you approached that, because obviously this was the work of an architect you admired, and you didn't necessarily want to create the same kind of bold intervention that you had done before.
Well, it was a very interesting brief of the museum, of the Denver Art Museum, who told me very clearly, they don't give us a box. We don't want to have another box. There's so many boxes for art.
So they said they didn't want a white cube, is that
They didn't
correct?
want white cube. They said to me, we want something that is about Denver. Now, what is Denver? Denver is a very creative city. At that time, people were saying, oh, we are a cow town. But believe me, the museum, which I just visited last month, has audiences of 1 million people a year come to this museum, which competes with Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and has exhibitions unprecedented, like Christian Dior exhibition that did not go to New York or LA, went to Denver. So again, space. You have to provide space, and this is a museum of contemporary art. Of course, the Gio Ponti building has more conventional, let's say, galleries, more tame galleries with set ceiling heights, and it's more like an office building. It's kind of a block. But this museum offers really public space. It's entertainment also, parties, celebrations. The building is used in multiple ways. It's not only, let's say, for the art that we know of. And in fact, Frederick Heinrich, who runs the museum today, he's the director, told me, I don't want to have art of artists who are older than 40 years old. He said, I'm not interested in artists who are already older than 40. I want to have artists who are younger, in the 30s and their 20s. And they are not doing paintings. They are doing projections. They are doing installations. They're using the walls themselves. So I really provided a place that can be used by artists in ways that are pretty radical, in very high spaces, oblique spaces, spaces that can be, directly dealt with by artists, sculptors, painters, performance artists. And it's working.
So how did you deal, as I originally mentioned, with the original architecture that you said early on that was very important
I touched it very lightly. I created a bridge, which is a glazed bridge that really connects the two buildings in an easy way. Of course, the main interest is in the new extension.
Yeah.
And by the way, I have to tell you, it's now called the Hamilton Wing.
Oh, is it?
Mr. Hamilton, who was a patron, an oil man, a very conservative. Imagine Denver. You're in oil. You're going to be very conservative. He has one of the biggest collections of Impressionist art. Art stopped with, Monet and so on. So he said to me when I first started, he said, Mr. Libeskind, I would like a building, and he's a patron. He's the man who's going to give some money, a lot of money. I would like a building with Corinthian capitals. I'd like a building in marble. I'd like a building with a pediment. Wow. I said, I'm going to have to work very hard to create kind of a new kind of pediment, new kind of columns. But after a while working through the building and with him, he became a fan of titanium. He became a fan of these forms. He said, I really love this. I didn't think I would ever like such a thing, but I'm going to put my name on the building, and I'm giving you all those millions of dollars that will make the building a reality. So you never know. People can change.
Yeah, and I guess if you create an architectural form that's so compelling, you could persuade your patrons to buy them in.
The building has to persuade them. You can never do it with words.
Yeah.
You can try, but it's gonna fall flat. But you have to show the space. You have to show the impact of a space which is not yet built through some level, probably through physical models. I think nobody's really impressed with renderings or perspectives, because now with computers, anybody can produce something fantastic with a machine. But if you create a physical model big enough for a head of a millionaire to go into it,
I mean, it's really interesting to hear about some of your kind of built projects, but I'm also interested to hear, every architect has projects that were unrealized.
Or a lot, of course.
And I was wondering if there are any particular you'd be willing to talk about or tell us about.
Well, being in London, I can't help but think of the V&A.
Yes.
That was a project that received even the blessing of the English heritage. They took big advertisements in the Times of London and other papers saying, we are not the old fuddy-duddies. We believe in architecture. Unfortunately, every building is a matter of karma. You have to have the right people, the right time, just the right moment of history for a building to happen of that sort. If it's a conventional building that is just, supplementing and hiding itself, then you don't need much luck. You'll get it built. But if you want to build something that is more ambitious, you need that lucky window, which I did not have. The directors changed. They became tired. The lottery became towards the end, and so on. So, look, I'm never a sentimentalist about the buildings I did not build, because you learn from every building you build. And nothing is really a waste of time if you put the effort into it. I look at the buildings of the great architects, of Borromini, of Le Corbusier, of the great architects, buildings that have never been built, and they inspire me. They are not buildings that have never been built, in my view. They've been built in drawings. They've been built in ideas. They have a future. So, a drawing, as I said, is a prophecy.
So how would you compare what you had in mind for the V&A for what was eventually built, which is, of course, this tiled courtyard on Exhibition Road?
The two things have nothing to do with each other, really. They've got nothing to do with each other. They come from two different worlds. One is a world of nice life. And one is a world of confronting, those radicals, William Morris, Henry Cole, who wanted the public to, socialists, who wanted the public to move forward. That was my world.
That's interesting. Thank you. I mean, I wanted to also talk about some of your future projects. I know you have a few things in the pipeline, one being a new Maggie Center.
Oh, yes.
That's a project I don't know so much about. It would be great if you could talk me through it.
Well, Maggie Centers are, Maggie Keswick was a person who unfortunately died from breast cancer. And these are centers, not medical centers, but next to large hospitals, who take care of people's life after they've been diagnosed with such a deadly and sad diagnosis. So they have experts who can help you. They have others who you can share your experience with. You can do yoga. You can meet people. You can have the family come. You can meet advisors. You can share your experience. In other words, in the national health here, the diagnosis takes 5 minutes. You're told something in 5 minutes. Then you go away. What am I going to do? I have a terrible diagnosis. So that's what a Maggie Center is. Now, my Maggie Center is in the...
So whereabouts will yours be?
It's in Hampstead, in the big hospital,
okay.
Royal Free Hospital. It's not a glorious site. It's in the back. It's where the parking lot is. But I thought that's interesting because it's very close to the main hospital. It's going to make that parking lot into something really, really nice with a little garden. And I don't have big windows that look on the hospital. I've created a kind of a very sinuous form that is very pleasant. And it's a modest building. It's only a 2-story building with a terrace for people to use.
Now, I mean, Maggie Centers, of course, are kind of cancer centers that are attached to hospitals, but have a very unusual form of architecture compared to other types of medical architecture. And so, this is your first Maggie's. Is that correct?
Well, Maggie has had illustrious architects working.
Yeah.
I love the idea that this should not be just some, again, facility, but have an ambition of being architecturally creative. And I've been a great admirer of Maggie Centers. In fact, Nina knew Maggie Keswick very well when she was ill. And Charles Jenks is a very close friend of mine.
And Charles Jenks is obviously the creator of Maggie.
Yes, it's an amazing idea, and I'm so lucky and honored to be doing it. We still need planning. We're going through
so what's the timeline? When should we expect to see that? Because that's obviously very close to home for people in the audience.
I think within the next 14, 16 months, I hope. It's really not bigger than a house, actually. It's like a 3-story house, 2-story house with a garden. Modest, but I think something that will contribute to a new perspective for people in that gigantic hospital, which is really not the most pleasant thing to see or be in.
Yeah.
And it's a little escape into a world of scale that is very human. And, it's wood, made in wood. It's a kind of counterpoint to the hospital.
And how does it relate to your previous work?
No, it doesn't. It's new. It's a complete new shape, new form. I actually, I don't know how, but I thought of a butterfly. I don't know why. When I had this project in mind, I don't know why, but papillon in French, Schmetterling in German, butterfly. Such an interesting group of words. And I thought, what does a butterfly look like if you were to freeze the movement of a butterfly? And that's kind of what I did. It's kind of a shape that is based on the wings. It's sinuous, and of course I'm working to develop it because it has to work. All the functions are very closely aligned. It's not like an institution. When you walk in, you have to feel that you're happy to be there.
I mean, the shape that's probably defined your work, I wouldn't have necessarily said the butterfly, so that's be really interesting to see. But it's probably the diagonal or the zigzag. I was wondering where that shape came from. I mean, in the book, you talk about the shape of the table that you used while you were at architecture school. Is it really, was it really something as functional as that?
No, if I have a minute, I have to tell you this story, because I grew up in the Bronx, in a public housing project. And we lived in a 2-room apartment, my sister and my parents. My parents slept in the living room. My sister and I slept, my sister's slightly older, in the bedroom. And then we had a kitchen, small kitchen. And my parents had bought a very ungainly Formica table. Really, immigrants What do they buy? They go to
Formica's not in Gailey anymore.
Formica. Well, the problem with the table was that it was straight and then had huge round corners. And, at that time, I had a T-square. Go to school. You got to do, brick courses, perfectly aligned, with a gap, perfectly drawn. So that table became my enemy. Because at some point, after dinner, when I cleaned up the table and put my paper, that I didn't know at what point that T-square was already on the curve. Could have been like, 1 millimeter, but it was already on the curve. Later on, I discovered, wow, you can go all the way around. Then you don't need to stop at the straight edge. You can keep going around the curve. And by the way, I'm very perplexed that Le Corbusier wrote a book called The Poem to the Right Angle. You probably read it. It's kind of a metaphysical book, Le Poème de l'Angle droit. His book dedicated to the right angle, in which he says that if someone ever goes beyond the right angle, the apocalypse will come upon the world. He says it.
That must explain Brexit.
Well, he was really he thought that apocalypse would come. But I thought, why not? 359 other possible angles in the world. And we have been limited. And now I said this to myself. When Plato invented the right angle, because he did, right? In the Timaeus, right? All those things. When he walked through Athens, there was not a single right angle, right? I mean, the Parthenon doesn't have a single right angle. You know that, right? All the columns are skewed. The pediment is curved. The stylobate is curved. There's no right angles. So the idea of a right angle, why? If he was to come back today, and that's what I actually think, all those great people, all those great thoughts we've been drilled into our heads, if those inventors, those thinkers came back today, they might have said, if they lived even 1 year longer, they might have said, I come to a different conclusion. I don't believe in this anymore. So why are we so sort of small-minded? We don't think that Plato would have a new idea, even if he had lived a little bit more time. So anyway, I always thought, that angle should have a point.
The other thing, one comment, just to finish really, that you make in the book that I was really intrigued by was that you said, and I'm someone who didn't go to architecture school. I studied kind of design history and got interested in architecture. But you said anyone could be an architect. And I thought that was an interesting statement, given that it's such a rigorous training process.
I was definitely,
what does
architects
that mean?
don't like when I say it. But I really believe that anybody can be an architect. Really, I think every person is creative. Everybody's an expert because they already have somewhere that they're sleeping. They have some corner somewhere. They already know the horizon. They know the world. Already, by the time they're 5 or 6 years old, they already are analysts of space, of time. So I think everybody kind of is intuitively already an architect.
Didn't you say architecture requires drawing? Because I think if so, you're overestimating my drawing skills at least.
I think everybody can draw. Everybody can sign their name. They can draw. If you can sign your name, even with an X, that's a good building. You could draw.
Right, get building. I think this is a good time to hand over to our wonderful audience. It would be fantastic to have some questions from you guys for Daniel. Can we have some hands up? I think there's one over here.
Hello. Question, you talk about the right angle. I'm interested in how you do your drawings. This closer. Oh, amazing.
Thank you.
Sound works. I'm interested in the relationship of plan and section in your work particularly. I would think it's difficult to describe in a traditional historic section. Can you just talk about how you move from organizational plan to plan and then whether the section is dead? That's my overall point, I suppose. Is the section dead in the buildings you're doing?
Is the section
Dead.
Dead.
dead? D-E-A-D?
Yeah. Is it of no use anymore?
Yes.
Does it have no more use? Is it pointless?
Oh, no. The section is incredibly important. How could you design a building without the section playing a primary role? Absolutely. I agree with you. But the section is also today not just one section. There are many sections that can organize a space. This is, I think, a new development, which is going back maybe, in a kind of asymmetrical way, back to other architects, Guarini and the Roman architects, and even earlier, to those who used to carve stones for medieval architecture. So the section is extremely important, but think about it in this way. We talked about Notre Dame. We know that in the medieval buildings, they didn't produce a set of working drawings. It wasn't like today, we have a set, particularly with computers, we can analyze every door handle and every minute, and everything is charted. They created really vignettes of composition that could be crafted by people who knew how to interpret those. And maybe that's really, we're getting more back to this kind of more medieval, I would say, way of working, where even though we have the technology to describe things very, very statistically, we can do different things with section, with plans, with even elevation. So I think it's a good question. I think, no, the section is not dead. It's well and alive.
The section is alive. Thank you. Should we take another question? Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask something that you've occasionally referred to, which is about the notion of memory, or particularly repressed memory in relation to sight. And you've often said we have to listen to the whispering voices, those voices that come across the abyss, and to build something truly significant has to be related to those voices. I just wondered if you could explain to me what those kind of voices mean. Do you mean people who've lived there, the occupation of the place before, the history, the narrative?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer it easily. But what does it mean to hear a voice? To hear a whisper? To hear something which no one else is hearing? You have to listen for something that is not, so to speak, in the noise, in the white noise that the city produces. And truly, you can hear a voice. I mean, you can hear voices all the time. And I don't mean just ghosts, although ghost would be already a good voice. It is. I mean, I am a student of Hamlet, and I've often wondered how amazing that this ghost is responsible for all the deaths in the play. It is this voice of someone who, for some people, is not there, and certainly for Hamlet, is there. For Shakespeare, who knows? So the voice is ghost, it may be a phantom, it could be a real voice whispering through the sand, the grass. I heard those voices, and I'm not really a mystic in that sense. I'm not somebody who's sort of just wild with imagination, but I think it's an effort to hear it, and particularly voices that have been repressed. I heard those voices. I actually heard those screams in Connecticut when I built my house. It's a green field, and you think it's a beautiful pastoral site, but the minute you step on it, you understand something about the native peoples of New York State, of Connecticut. Who lived there? It wasn't these people today. It was native people who have been eliminated. They are not there. We don't know. We have only the names of places that signify that they were there. But you can feel, you can hear the cry. And by the way, the building that I built, which is a house, is kind of related in its violent external shapes to cutting into the ground in a particular way. So, yeah, I think the voices, they're there. And often through propaganda and through neglect, we are oblivious to them. Yeah. It's not a metaphor.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to you. Okay.
Well, thank you. My question is also about voices, voices of survivors. And I wonder how you took that into account, particularly with the Jewish Museum in Berlin and, of course, Ground Zero in New York.
Well, I thought a lot about it. First of all, I plotted that star that I started with, just an emblem, connecting 6 addresses along the point of that star geometrically in the city. And I kind of intermarried Germans, non-Jews, and Jews who would never have been married in life, like Paul Celan and Friedrich Schleiermacher, the Protestant theologian, or Rachel Varnhagen and E.T.A. Hoffmann. And then I ramified the system to many more points, addresses where people lived. They lived full lives, and one day they just disappeared. They were not there anymore. I plotted many addresses. I have to say hundreds. I couldn't say thousands. But it could have been, because you could go on and on. And I tried to derive the geometry of the building, the windows, the topography of this invisible map. Because when you look at Berlin, they're not there. The addresses may be there, like on Lindenstrasse, but it's a totally different city, totally new city. Somehow, through a reference to what is not there. So the building of the Jewish Museum is actually dedicated to what is not there. Almost every space is a space that presents you something which is absent. And the very center of the museum is also an absence. It's not a usable museum space. It's a space you walk across. And by the way, just to go one step further, I actually completed an opera in my mind that was not completed in Berlin by Aaron Schoenberg, Moses and Aaron, where he stopped, the opera stops after 2 acts. I don't know if anybody heard that opera. It's amazing. It's seldom performed. It's Schoenberg's masterpiece. It ends just as Schoenberg ends his life, has to leave Berlin, exiled as, professor of music, great composer, bye-bye. And he ends up with an aporia where Moses calls to God. And there is just a silence. And the number 3, libretto 3, is empty. There's nothing more. But I thought you could complete it in a kind of quasi-musical way or a para-musical way by the echoes of the footsteps of the visitors across that void. And actually it's true. If you listen for a minute to that space, it's the answer that Moses got. It's the answer that was hanging in the air back in 1937 when Schoenberg left. That has been sort of transmitted through hope into our era of Berlin as a fantastic new capital of a free country. So there are various techniques architects can use, or others can use various techniques. One needs to develop a technique. In my book, I speak about the Labyrinth, which is really a technique. How do you create a technique that is appropriate to a project? Certainly a house is different from a museum of history or something else. And I've always thought of Daedalus, who created the Labyrinth in ancient Greece. And also he created the wings to get out of it. It's not only the labyrinth, but how to get out of the labyrinth. And of course, his son Icarus died because he went too close, and the sun melted the wings. So it's something I thought a lot about, because the Greeks were very, very intellectual, thinking out this problem of technique.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think we maybe have time for one more.
One more question? Yes, there's somebody there.
Thank you. So you were talking that to design for memory, it's important to have a true commitment to democracy. But today we hear more and more that democracy is in crisis. And if you agree with that statement, how do you think designers and architects can tackle this crisis?
You're right. We live in a very polarized world, which is threatened, by dark forces. Globally, everywhere. How do we respond? I think we have to respond, in a political way, which means as citizens. Politeia is the city. Every person has to respond in some way by forming solidarity with groups, by acting in the way through their professions, whatever they can do to resist the temptation to undermining democracy. And the temptation is there. Look, the founders of America, Benjamin Franklin, who I admire, said, we have a democracy in America as long as we can keep it. He added, as long as we can keep it. No one guarantees democracy. And as I travel around the world, I see the similarity of people's today unhappiness, the immigrants, the foreigners, the threats, the fear. That's kind of global. And it's a very unhealthy way, I think, to live. If we allow fear and threats to embody us into a shell, we will become liable to be manipulated by the media, by the internet, by dictators, and so on. I think it's a problem that is now upon all of us. I have no answer for anybody else. I just know what I try to do, which is try to involve myself as much as I can in things that have a meaning and that state that there is a red line which you cannot cross. There is a difference between truth and fiction. Hannah Arendt, in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, says the following. I never forgot. She said, it's not the committed member of the Communist Party or the card-carrying Nazi who is the threat, but it's the regular citizen who has stopped worrying about what is true and what is false. That's the threat. She's such a great analyst. I mean, think about it. It's not the card-carrying members of Nazi Party or KKK or communists that are the threat, but just regular people who have ceased really being interested in what is true and what is not true. And so we have conspiracy theories, we have kind of mass movements towards escaping the changes that are taking place. I think we live in an amazing time. I'm an optimist, actually, about the time we live in. Despite all the signs to the contrary, I think it's a time of change, and I think if we are involved, I think we can pass through this time of what they call surveillance capitalism and come to a more equitable society. And by the way, I just won several competitions in New York for public housing. You know, I've done a lot of luxury housing, which is fantastic. I love it. But I won a competition in Bedford-Stuyvesant, poor neighborhood with those blocks of brick. And to show that for the same amount of money, the same low cost, you can build dignified, green, good architecture that is sustainable, that people will enjoy living in. So yeah, I didn't do it before, but it's never too late.
Thank you so much. I think you've really brought us back to the present and also left us on an optimistic note that architecture can be a democratizing force. Thank you. Those questions were really, really thoughtful. Really constructive. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much,
Daniel.
Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.